Reading from the Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, God.
Jesus said to his disciples, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day that Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and carried them all away. So it will be also at the coming of the Son of Man. Two men will be out in the field. One will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, and one will be left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on which day I will come. Be sure of this. If the master of the house had known the hour of night when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into. So too you also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." These are the words of our brother Jesus. Thanks be to God. Have a seat. Well, it was at Thanksgiving this year when 8-year-old Graham, who noticed the large dinner bell that we have hanging at the top of our basement stairs with a newly installed door with locks on it. He said, "Grandma, why do you have that bell there?" All evening, Graham and his twin brother Sawyer had been running around the basement finding lost treasures like Pokemon cards and fancy marbles and Matchbox cars and children's-sized jewelry. They were the toys left behind by the children who lived in our basement all summer. As you know, for about 4 months, we had a homeless single mother and her 2 children, all of them without appropriate papers to be in this country, staying with us. They were displaced and desperate and at risk with the current rise in ICE raids and deportations. But how do you explain that to an 8-year-old child? "Those toys belonged to some children who lived in our basement for a while," I said. "And the bell was there to warn them if someone who wanted to hurt them came to our home. It was so that they could lock the door and hide until that person left." "But Grandma," said Graham, "who would want to hurt children?" I could feel this bubble around him begin to burst. As a child who was loved and protected by his parents and given some privilege by society, I said, "Oh, Graham," as all the adults in the room were hanging on my every word, "not everyone in this world is safe to be around." And I just let it go at that. Not everyone in this world is safe, and unfortunately, we must be awake, alert, and prepared. It seems to be the message of our gospel story. For in the days of Noah before the flood, they were eating and drinking. They did not know until the flood came. They carried them all away. The story taken from the Old Testament reminds me of the tragic floods in Texas this past summer that swept those young girls away while they slept in their bunk beds at summer camp. The message is to stay awake, to remain hyper vigilant. There will be a day when we least expect it that our lives will take an unprecedented turn. But if you know the story, the family that lived with us, then you know that much of the anxiety that prompted us to hang that bell and to prepare was our anxiety, not theirs. We feared what would happen to them while they lived with great optimism and hope. How does that happen without being naive or maybe a little delusional when it comes to hard realities in our world today? How does one find hope? Our first reading is one of judgment and promise. Judgment for the way in which Israel had behaved, and promise of a better day. Seminarian Michael Chan calls this promise absurd. It's absurd when examined against Israel's ancient history. The mountain of the Lord, according to Chan, was never the most prominent mountain. Nations have never streamed to Jerusalem to learn divine teachings. Yahweh is yet to play the role of international mediator in times of conflict, and the waging of warfare continues to afflict creation and that region of our world in particular to this very day. And so it feels as if our rational brains have to switch off to find hope in the message of this prophecy. Does a vision of a brighter day have to be real to give us hope? Is a little magical thinking okay? The same could be said about the second advent of Christ, as mentioned in our gospel reading, that there'll come a time when all the falsehoods will be defeated, the dead will rise, the devil and his forces will be destroyed, and death will be no more. All of this contradicts much of what we see in the world 2,000 years after Jesus warned his disciples to stay awake, to be prepared. Paul gives us a sort of fake it till you make it approach. He says, put on the armor of Christ so that you'll be prepared to meet him when he comes again. Live the reality that you desire. Be the peace that you want for the world. Embody the love that you long to see. Paul says our salvation is nearer than we first believed. The night is advanced, the day is at hand. So let us then throw off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light, trusting God's Spirit to begin working a new creation in our lives today, even as we await the fullness of this transformation in the next life. The hope, according to Paul, is that there will come a day when we will be swept up in a cloud and taken into glory with Jesus, which feels a little like our house guests believing in the American dream, in democracy and freedom. Are we only fooling ourselves? Are we hoping in the absurd? Is it okay to hope in the absurd? In a podcast called Liminal Living, I recommend this podcast to you, host Thomas Rundle interviews Brian McLaren in an episode titled Reimagining God for the Modern World. Liminal living for many Christians, as we've read about in some of our books, is a space where we live honestly with both a great affection for and a troubled relationship with the church and her teachings. It's a most difficult space, like letting go of one trapeze bar before the next is fully within reach. There's no way of predicting where you will land, what the new understanding of God and the universe God created will look like. For how are we to live with one another and what God intends for our church in a modern world? For both Dr. Rundle and Brian McLaren, who are theological scholars and longtime pastors, there came a time in their lives where belief in the promise of a second coming or in life after death ceased to bring hope to them in their personal struggles. Brian McLaren suggested that our beliefs have been shaped by Enlightenment, rationalism, and Christian orthodoxy. You see, Pope Leo is in Turkey, right? And he's talking about Nicaea. We go way back. And we have not freed ourselves to think outside those categories, not very easily anyway. Imagination, says McLaren, becomes incredibly important at times like this. We need to recontextualize the Bible. But we are still living with medieval theologies, the ones that we've been told to hold. We still refuse to accept what Copernicus told us, that we aren't the center of the universe. We haven't caught up to Copernicus or Darwin or Einstein. And it is an allegiance to our medieval creeds that the church says we cannot question. Dr. Rundle shared from his own life experiences, saying that as a child, the world was magical and simple. If you did something wrong, God punished you. The rules were clear. And then when he grew up, he experienced tragedy. Life didn't work out the way he thought it would. At times like that, the world you live in becomes unenchanted and cynicism starts to take over. Have you known that cynicism? I certainly have. For Tom Rundle, those tragedies included losing a child and having another child born with significant disabilities. Life became hard. He says just going through lots of hard things tends to suck the magic out of your world. And he says, but I want to re-enchant my world without leaning into old superstitions. How do you make that happen? How do we do that? Do we fake it until we make it, as Paul suggests? Put on those characteristics that God desires for us until we are transformed and ultimately transformed in the next life, a sort of just do it way of living. Or do we stay awake, always watching the horizon for a better day, always ready, always hoping, always prepared, as in our gospel reading? If we're always prepared for the absurdly good to happen, if we, like Martin Luther King, hold on to a dream of a better time, a better world, we too may never live to see it happen. But we might feel better in just believing that it is possible. You could say we would be holding on to hope, no matter how unrealistic. But if we are always prepared, always awake, watching for some looming tragedy to happen next, like the flood in the time of Noah, then we'll live with perpetual anxiety. Being hypervigilant like that reminds me of post-traumatic stress disorder, that state of mind where once you are harmed, once you've experienced trauma, you're continuously on guard for the next trauma to happen. This is something that Father Greg Boyle is well acquainted with in his work with the homeboys. Father Boyle says that the tragedies in life leave their marks on us. There's no way around that. But the key, says Father Boyle, is to not want for a life without trauma, but to integrate that trauma into the whole of our being. Certainly Jesus did that. The nail marks were still visible when he came to the upper room to be with those he loved. Father Boyle says we must maintain a stance that is willing to hold the pain of our trauma, even with affectionate awe. An affectionate awe that permits suffering to be the teacher for all of us. Oscar Romero once said, there are many things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. And so it is this affectionate awe that deepens us and deepens humanity. This is a heightened state of awareness, and it means becoming more like Christ, aware of your pain and suffering. You could say we are enfolded into a Christ consciousness. Do you, like Tom Rundle, long to live with a sense of enchantment again? It is the season of Christmas, after all. Can we find hope in this magical season, yet remain grounded in the difficulties and the realities of this current world? What if we remain awake, not expecting doom and gloom and not expecting something that, as Dr. Rundle calls it, is superstition? But what if we remained awake to those things we can hold in affectionate awe? As Brian McLaren left ministry, he was burned out and disillusioned, and he and his wife went on a long trip. On that first Sunday, no longer a pastor, they wandered through the streets of Sydney, Australia, and they came upon a neighborhood with little shops and restaurants. From a distance, they heard the sound of jazz, and they found a little band playing in a courtyard. At the front of the stage was a little boy, about Graham's age, about 8 years old. Brian could tell by his appearance that he was a child with special needs. And he was completely lost in the music. His parents were standing next to Brian, and they were arguing between themselves about whether or not they should go get their child, who was at this point becoming a bit of a spectacle. But before they could move, the sax player jumped off the stage and stood next to the child playing. And the trumpet player did the same thing. The child's eyes were still closed, but when he opened them and saw that he was a part of the band because they came to him, Brian says he had this look of ecstasy on his face, and he began jumping up and down with intense joy. Yes, a child shall lead us. Brian concluded, if God ever felt real to me, it was in that moment. We talk of incarnation, and it is indeed a paradox. You could even call it absurd that Jesus humbled himself to share in our humanity. But when we are awake to those everyday moments, when we, like this young child and like the community that embraced him, embody the divinity of Christ, then we discover the sort of re-enchantment that gives us hope. May it be so.